We'll go ahead and get started with our second session, which is ethics, self-care, supervision, and decision-making strategies, being presented by Dr. Susan Cutler-Egbert. Susan is an LCSW, a clinical professor of social work, and the MSW program director at Utah State University. Her experience includes direct practice with children and families, child welfare research, and 25 years of teaching MSW students, first at the University of Utah and then at USU. She's passionate about building and sustaining a competent and ethical professional workforce. So the time is now Susan's. And if you, again, kind of the same things, have questions, please throw them in the chat. And yeah, let me know if you have any problems.
Thank you so much. One thing that is a little bit disappointing about today is that I love having breakout sessions, and that's not going to work out today. So despite the fact that there are nearly 100 of us, let's try to make it feel like a conversation. Raise your hand. Teresa can help me with that. Put things in the chat. I love a lively chat. First of all, I just wish Mike's presentation went way too fast for me, and I'm really honored to be following Mike Hanley. I met him as one of our agency field instructors, and it was just, he's a very impactful person for me to be around because he has been a guest speaker for our students. And the first time I heard him, I just was inspired by his just the way he exemplifies social work values and way of being, and as well as all the things he knows, right? The way he talks about clients and their struggles, the way he talks about the students that he's mentoring, the way he supports, the growth of professionals that are coming up, and just the way he continues to learn and be passionate about that. I loved hearing him talk about that. So he may be off doing other things by now, but I really wanted to thank him for his time today and sharing his expertise. I see so many familiar names on this participant list that I am not able to welcome you all individually as we would if this weren't virtual, but it sure makes it so a lot of people can be here from a distance. So I've grown to love Zoom, this environment. And anyway, just know that I've seen your name. I'm so glad you're here. And I would love to hear about your career and how it's going. And so excited for the work that you are doing. So I usually have a sidekick, as you know, Sean Camp. So I don't know if there's enough smoke and mirrors in this world for me to make it through a presentation like this without him, but we will give it a try. I was just listed as ethics. Most of you who know me know that I'm an ethics geek. Like I'm really invested in ethical practice. I have known of and heard a lot of difficult stories around ethics. And I spent some time on the Doppel board, and it's just always a hard situation, right? And so when I thought about ethics and what I wanted to share today, some of it is, a piece of other things I've done, but many of you have probably seen my self-care more than you would want to talk about trauma stewardship. I am going to include that a bit. But I've added hopefully merge some things together. So self-care, supervision, and decision-making strategies. So many of us are in situations where we're supervising other people more and more. And we've got a lot of people coming up through the ranks to be supervised. And with changes in our licensure and other things, I just lay awake at night a little thinking how important supervision is going to be in terms of mentoring, priming people for ethics and for ethical practice, and how important, supervising is going to be in the picture and the landscape that we have. And then just a couple of decision-making models that we're going to look at. My objectives officially are to help us learn about compassion fatigue, burnout, and secondary trauma, and to recognize the ethical obligation that we all have as individuals to do ongoing self-assessment and management. Long ago, I volunteered in a kindergarten classroom, and I learned so much in kindergarten classrooms. That's really kind of what I planned to do with my life until I decided I was maybe a little too angry to color and laminate that much, but I would still love it. And also arriving at 7:30 in the morning would not be my jam. I teach night classes, but there was so much to learn in that environment. And one thing I learned one day while volunteering, the little squares on the rug, the class was in a bit of a state of chaos. And rather than the teacher kind of globally like addressing the whole group at once, she just said, everyone check yourself. And that was a cue that she had for each individual to basically assess and manage their own behavior. So I've thought about that a lot. If we spent a lot of time checking ourselves, and we're going to talk a lot about kind of some of the ways people get in ethical struggles. But what about a world where everyone just checked themselves and didn't wait to like get caught, or if they don't get caught, it's okay. That'd be amazing, wouldn't it? We also want to process the concept of the slippery slope. And this is a term that's used in different areas in different ways. But as it relates to ethics, it's about an incremental lowering of ethical standards over time on the part of individuals, but I would dare purport on the part, it can happen organizationally, it can happen at different levels through small changes in thought and behavior over time. And then third, consider the critical role that supervision plays in ethical practice. And my hope is to engage in group learning about that, but it's going to be a big group. We're up to 99 about effective supervision in clinical settings. So then I've got some ethical decision-making models, actually 2 of them. One's super simple, one's a little more kind of expanded from that. And then we have some practice scenarios to look at. I don't love sage on the stage. So if anybody wants to say anything, raise your hand. So first objective here, we're going to look at the ethical obligation of self-care. And this is something, thankfully, that our field has actually addressed in recent years. Honestly, when we started basically talking about it, and I go to counsel on social work education, and finally people are like, oh, hey, how about self-care? Our students are under stress, their own trauma has been activated, all these things are happening. Maybe we should think about this. And that was refreshing after a couple of decades of not. But compassion fatigue, when we think about that, it's a deep erosion of our compassion and our ability to tolerate the strong emotions and difficult stories in others. I'm going to keep referring to Mike's presentation over and over. But at the beginning of his presentation, how he talked about we willingly, voluntarily enter into this people's lives on their hardest days, about their hardest situations. And that we have to protect against that erosion of that compassion that brought us to the field, or we can end up with a loss of ability to care. And then there's burnout, physical and emotional exhaustion due to prolonged stress and frustration. And that doesn't just involve our clients, right? And their struggles and behavior, but work within these systems, within this social cultural environment. It's all pretty hard. Depleted ability to cope with work-life demands, feeling powerless to achieve goals. I cannot tell you how many professionals my age, myself included, are now making peace with autoimmune disorders. And I say making peace because, for a lot of years, my perspective was get up and fight through every day. And then pretty soon, right, Vincent Folletti, ACEs, the body presents its bill. And you can't really do that anymore. You have to make peace. Make peace. Don't fight the battle anymore. And secondary or vicarious trauma. And that's repeated exposure to difficult stories and situation that over time actually change our view of the world. Yeah, sometimes we just get there. When we talk about the professional risks involved, we might discover that the sometimes terrible situations that are sometimes, why do I have the word sometimes in there? Our clients struggle with the pressure and demands of our jobs. We have tight schedules. We have unrealistic expectations, sometimes of ourselves. We lack positive feedback and support at times, and it really adds to our psychological and emotional loads. Without realizing it, this is like ordinalcy. And then without realizing it, we can often become resentful rather than resourceful. All of a sudden, we're like resenting our work, our colleagues, our organization, sometimes our clients even. We can become detached rather than delighted. We can become exhausted rather than excited and engaged, right? In an effort to compensate, we can become excessively dedicated. That's some people's response, like let everything go in my personal life because I am going to be, the hero at work. We can become overly compulsive. We can become perfectionistic, and we can have a really unhealthy focus on achievement and get really tied up into the outcomes of our clients, those we serve, etc. I've taken some cartoons from a book that I'm going to refer to in a minute, but I love this. Like run, 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 run on the rat wheel, right? And then the other little rats, like, I had an epiphany, and they just decided to sit down. So that part is interesting. So this is the book that I'm referring to. I don't know why it's possibly the most blurry picture of it ever. But hopefully you can get the gist. It's been out since 2008. We continue to use it as we teach students because it's just great. It's awesome. I love that it's not just about even our work as mental health professionals. It is also about those who serve the planet, those who are trying to keep species alive, emergency service, first responders, on and on. And as we've had the opportunity to give this part of our message, basically kind of coast to coast, we're often approached with just people from all different realms who this is very applicable to. So if you have others in your life who maybe aren't mental health professionals but could benefit from this message, it's great. And she's got a pretty great video on YouTube as well, a little TED Talk that kind of introduces it. This is from a totally different book, just of like musings that are helpful to the human experience. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as realistic as expecting to be able to walk through water and not get wet. So that's not really realistic, right? That's from Kitchen Table Wisdom. Why we would think that we can do this work, that we can meet people on their hardest days, and if it's not that, talk about their hardest days, support them in overcoming the struggles in their life, and not feel anything that is not going to happen. So from the book, a transformation that takes place within us as a result of being exposed to the suffering of other living beings or the planet that impacts mind, body, and spirit. And we have to consider this is like a normal response to trauma exposure. So we have to kind of up our game, right? Lazarus stress and coping theory. We know that our chosen profession, the work we do, adds stress. So we are going to have to, with intention, add coping. All right. I'm going to just take a peek at the chat and see if there are any questions or anything. Oh, good. Okay. Here we go. So specifically, and there are a lot of elements of the code of ethics that are relevant, but the one that's very relevant here, as you can see, I've kind of clipped the whole social worker ethical responsibilities as professionals here for competence, non-discrimination, private conduct, dishonesty, fraud, and deception, impairment is what we're focused on here. Social workers should not allow their own personal problems, psychosocial distress, legal problems, substance abuse, or mental health difficulties to interfere with their professional judgment and performance or to jeopardize the best interests of people for whom they have a professional responsibility. That is client level, but it's also colleagues, supervisees, students in my case, in many of your cases, etc. And social workers whose personal problems, psychosocial distress, legal problems, substance abuse, or mental health difficulties interfere with their professional judgment and performance should immediately seek consultation and take appropriate remedial action by seeking professional help, making adjustments in workload, terminating practice, or taking any other steps necessary to protect clients and others. And that is part of check yourself, right? But it also creates an obligation for us to support our colleagues when we see impairment. And just following up on the ethical responsibilities there on the right, misrepresentation, solicitations, acknowledging credit for other people's work is also important and part of the code. Now, while we're going through this, I want you to, since we can't do our breakout sessions and have these little discussions with each other, I would like you to think about someone you know. I'm celebrating 35 years in the field this summer. And I have seen multiple situations where colleagues and other professionals have had consequences for ethical violations, for crossing that line. I'd be interested in the chat for you to think about situations you have seen. And I would like you just to write in the chat, since we're not polling either, consequences from crossing ethical lines that you have seen for colleagues. No names, please. That would be unethical. Just put some things in the chat. What are consequences? What have people lost through ethical struggles? Okay. Yeah. Jobs, jail time, loss of license, which means loss of career, probation, which as a person who sat at the other side of the table, I can only imagine how difficult that is to come. It's a very supportive process in social work. It tries to be, but also a boundary keeping for the profession, trust of the client, demotion, trust. Other lines are more easily blurred. And Annalie, we're going to talk about that slippery slope. Loss of license due to romantic relationship with a client. I thankfully to this day have never seen any of my students' names, knock on wood, in the news. But I certainly have heard of so many situations. I tell my students, Susan's brutal honesty, it is never a good idea to sleep with a client, the client's mother, cousin, neighbor, anyone. Just maybe find relationships elsewhere, right? Reputation, excellent. Loss of family, right? Those are difficult situations. Again, it's my perspective that no one wakes up one day and says, I think I'll throw my career away today. I think, that doesn't happen. So how do people get to that point? What is the kind of thinking that is involved with that? So one thing I did notice and have noticed in all of the situations where people experience these consequences, which are rough, I mean, really difficult, is that self-assessment and management and self-care and what we would call trauma stewardship is not happening. So you see this cartoon, Lassie. I don't know how many of you even remember this show at this point. I still do. It was reruns, so it's been a while, unless maybe they had like a Lassie, refresh. I don't know. But lots of helping that, that kid Timmy was always getting himself in these struggles, dramas, and Lassie had to come save the day. And so finally, Lassie needed to get help, and thankfully she did. We have to maintain a high level of critical awareness, self-awareness. We have to be kind of honest with ourselves. We have to acknowledge the effects of trauma, exposure, and burnout. We have to make room amongst all this processing with other people and helping them heal for us to have our own internal process. We need permission to feel the feels, think the thoughts, experience our own activation of our own traumas. Some people call that triggers. I'm into activation now. Activating our own traumas and determining what we need to get back on track. Basically getting all social worky about ourselves and our experience, using the problem-solving model, using those competencies of engaging in this process, assessing, intervening, and evaluating how it's going, right? Having that commitment. I had Teresa just throw a bunch of stuff in the chat. And one was hopefully the ProQual, and that is a little assessment that you can use. It's interesting when we have students do these, we seriously underreport to ourselves in terms of self-awareness how much stress is affecting us, how potentially impaired that we are. So click. I really like this. This is from Canada.
So we should find somebody to buy a house with. That's what we should do.
And so this is out of Canada's mental health system, and we've adapted it a bit, Sean and I, kind of thinking about constantly the continuum that we are around, healthy, reacting, injured, and ill, and those different levels. And knowing that we need self-care and social support when we're hitting the yellow and the orange. And when we're getting into the orange, we definitely need professional self-care and professional support, right? So I won't go into the details of these. Hopefully you can see them or you can open up the slides. It's a little model that you can use to assess. And just know when you're in the orange or red, the goal is to reduce the frequency that you get there by management. If you do get there, to reduce the intensity and the duration, right? That you're experiencing these difficult things. You know what? There's also the concept, let me just finish up on that before we move on, of basically engaging in a maintenance plan for ourselves, a prevention plan, an upfront, taking care of ourselves the best way we know how. And we also need a safety plan for the times when things are so big, events are so large, either in our personal life or our professional life, that we have a safety plan that we can access readily. Okay. Let's see. I have seen many serious boundary violations that resulted in discipline and even third-degree felony charges. Yeah, that is interesting, Mike. I love that. Boundary crossing, such as being constantly late for sessions and ending sessions early. That's interesting to me. And sometimes we maybe become emotionally upset during a session. It's difficult to be present for the next client that walks in. Sometimes I have to take some time and notice that I'm not in a place to help someone that same day. Yeah, thank you, Tim. Got everything. So, and Mike brings up a good point. Things that don't seem like a huge deal. But incrementally, that's when we're going to move to the slippery slope now. Incremental, step by step, lowering of our standards over time. Bandura, way back, historical reference here. Moral disengagement is a form of moral self-deception that allows individuals to justify unethical behavior and avoid self-censure. So in the situation where we're like billing for things that didn't really happen, or our paperwork or our time that we're recording or whatever, justifying behavior like, well, this is a really hard job. They don't pay me enough. I am still a good person, great therapist. For the 35 minutes I spend with this person, I am right there doing my best. Because normally people engage in ethical self-regulation. It's despite what we've seen in recent years in human behavior, which is like really difficult for me to process based on what I think humans are like and, their innate goodness. Normally people, they check themselves and they have self-regulation. And if they do something, they're like, oh, that didn't feel good. I'm going to do something different. However, through moral disengagement, individuals rationalize their questionable conduct, they minimize their personal responsibility, and they dehumanize potential victims. And we know that, some of us from our work, with people who might engage in criminal activity and victimization of other people, that there's some cognitive pieces that are sometimes hard to understand, but it's interesting that we as professionals also need to work on that. Because of this rationalization process, people are more likely to slip into a pattern of behavior, and they feel fine about doing something a little bit worse the next time. And then they commit more severe unethical actions. And that's what's called the slippery slope effect. And it's just what it sounds like. Picture yourself on a slippery slope, right? So there's some interesting research. And and these researchers studied via several different studies, which I find is interesting. They like gave people several different tests, and that people are more likely to justify small ethical indiscretions than major ones. Kind of makes sense. Over time, they justify more and more, and they can be led to justify even big indiscretions. And when faced with abrupt and large dilemmas, rather than those that are gradually increased, they're less likely to be unethical. Like they would say, no, I would never do that. There are some situations where from an outside view, it feels like, how did you end up the canyon with a, minor client destroying your career one afternoon? What? What was that slippery slope? It must have been a steep one. But they're more likely to make unethical choices if they're faced with indiscretions gradually over time. Okay, so I think we've got the concept there. So I want to now take this and apply it to supervision, okay? Because that's a piece of what I want to talk about. So many of you are field instructors, you're clinical supervisors. If you're not, you will be sooner rather than later with our current workforce growth that we're working on. So there's a critical role that supervision plays in ethics. And the slippery slope effect can be reduced by inducing a prevention focus. See, okay, parallel process. The self-care piece, prevention, so that we can manage big events. And this is also applicable right into the ethics conversation. So a mindset associated with self-regulation around ethical behavior that makes people more vigilant and thereby deactivates that justification process that happens. We have to think to ourselves, and those of us who are in charge in an administrative way, does this organization possess a strong ethical culture in which misconduct is clearly defined and even small deviations are quickly addressed? Those who notice and address questionable employee conduct may be able to reduce the likelihood that minor indiscretions will escalate over time. So kind of the classic nip it in the bud, right? So are we watching for those minor indiscretions? Are we talking about those? Are we processing with those we supervise and ourselves what those mean, the underlying thoughts, potential justification, and the reasoning around that? And then contextual factors such as ethical climate, a specific code of conduct, monitoring, and ethical priming, which is what we try to do with our students, where we have specific conversations about ethics, potential struggles. We don't do that, things like that may all reduce the slippery slope effect or prevent it from occurring. So we basically, and this came out of a business article that was very interesting, but it ended up getting published in Applied Psychology, create an environment in which employees are less likely to experience increased moral disengagement. It's kind of like one of those negative, positive things. We want more moral engagement, right? From the strengths perspective. So we want environments where employees do not have as much of a window to experience that. And part of the research shows, some of this is temperament. And we all know that. Like, being a zealot is hard in terms of research ethics. I have I parented extensively, and I had different kids, and they all went through situations where they basically needed to be talked about about ethics, mostly with regard to saying things that were true, or honesty is a thing that parents get to address. Now, some of my kids, I would like give them a little worksheet, like, okay, look up these words in the dictionary: trust, you know, honesty, all these words that they could define, and then we could talk about them. And then I had a conversation with one of my younger daughters where I said, you know how you feel bad when you lie? And she just looked at me and said, no. And I thought, okay, I've got to find the common ground here, because just like anything, what I assumed was an experience for everyone, temperamentally wasn't for her. So we need to kind of assess and know where people are at in terms of temperament to be able to have these conversations. Okay, I'm going to check the chat. Does anybody have any? Oh, subtle ones are often overlooked. Excellent. Yes, gateway.
And then Susan, we have an example that somebody put in the chat just whenever
Okay.
we're ready for.
You want me to read it, or do you want to read it, Teresa?
I can read it.
Excellent.
So it says, my supervisor and I were talking about this ethical dilemma today, and I'm wondering what you would suggest in this situation. Therapist has a client who is an undocumented person. They have been getting work and paid well under the table from a person in their religious congregation. The person will sometimes pay them $100 for 2 hours of work, sometimes $100 for 10 hours of work. At times, the person who is giving the client work will tell them they will pay them $1,000 to $5,000 for sexual acts. But the client isn't okay with that, but feels trapped working for this person and just taking what they give, since other people that have given the client work only pay $2 an hour. The client doesn't want this reported. The client doesn't want this report, the person who employs them, because they don't want to lose the good pay, and they are worried about being deported if they report it. They aren't okay with what is happening. Either the therapist has assigned release to ecclesiastical leader and wants to report, but is conflicted.
Wow. Yes, let's talk about these models of decision making, and we can add that one to our case study. Let's see. I was about to say, Andreina, it sounds like trafficking to me. But thank you for the resource. Nice. Let's look at this model as you look at that. So this is the simplified model. It's kind of a seminal model from Elaine Congress, and I found it most recently. It's available at that site. I have Sage, I think that's the one. No, her university has put it online. Examine relevant values. Spells the word ethic. It's hard to forget. So everyone process that case in the chat in your head. Okay, and we'll talk about it. Think about relevant laws, which were brought up first thing, policies, regulations, and code provisions, code of ethics, right? Hypothesize about different consequences. Identify who will be helped and harmed in terms of social work's focus on the most vulnerable. Consult with supervisors and other colleagues. Okay, from that, what are the relevant values in that scenario? Put them in the chat. What are the relevant laws and policies? Andreina addressed that. What are the different consequences that may happen? Deportation is one that the client is very worried about. Who will be helped and who will be harmed based on the choice that you make as a professional. And again, kind of who are we working for? Who are we serving? Who are we protecting? Consult with supervisors and other colleagues. Okay. Yeah. Confidentiality, undocumented status. That is very. Here's the one thing I want to tell you all. There's a reason these are called dilemmas. And I work with my students. We just had a seminar about these in field. And I said, we have an assignment where they go and ask their field instructor for a dilemma. And then we process those. And they were all basically like, it became kind of a competition. Like, this is dicier than yours. And this one is bigger. And this, no one can beat this. You cannot make this stuff up. That is one thing I always say. Things, the unimaginable. And there is rarely, well, sometimes if something's against the law, then it's not a dilemma, right? You're a mandatory reporter. You are going to report, but sometimes there's all kinds of things at work. And as we think about client self-determination, and as we think about it just becomes very complicated. So that's why we're looking at all of these pieces. Yes. Okay. It's like I'm reading the chat without reading it. We're on the same page, people. Here's a kind of a bigger model. All right. And this is also out of Canada. Just having a great week with these smart thinkers. Again, it's not a clear road that we're taking. This one's bigger. What is the ethical dilemma? Clearly articulate our professional values that are in conflict. That's what makes it a dilemma. What personal values, if any, may be influencing my decision-making? Is there a conflict right now between my personal and my professional values? And there often is. What is my immediate reaction or instinct for the best way to address it? So you're brainstorming. Consult the code. Does the code provide direction and guidance? Because that is what you will be held accountable to. I am not taking the approach. This is not a class about how to not be in trouble with Doppel. Okay? This is a class about how to be a competent, professional, ethical practitioner. And that reminds me, I have one more handout to put in the chat. Once I get off all these 5 screens. Review applicable agency policies and best practice standards. And here's a plug for agency policy. Okay. We have other assignments in graduate school where we send our students, hey, look at your agency policy and see what you think you could contribute to or help improve. And they come back, you know, nobody can find the policies or nobody's written any, and that's very terrifying to me. Really think about your policies and think through some of the case scenarios. I always say good policies, you know, all policy is built on someone else's no, because really, isn't that how we build policy? Like, oh, this went wrong, we should get a policy. But it would be awesome if we had kind of preventive, proactive policy development at the agency and organizational level, because sometimes the legislative level leaves a gap for me. So my practice involved, I'm an adopted person. I work with adoptive families. Adoption placement in Utah, as you know, read the news, has been a very interesting place ethically. And in my mind, the expectations of legislative policy in our state were here. Best practice were here. was here. Yeah, was grammatics. And there's this huge gap. This gap can only be made up through ethics, ethical practice, ethical policy, right? Competence. That is, and we have a lot of areas in our state, which is not we're not huge fans in Utah of a lot of rules. Just drive down the freeway and see how many people are FaceTiming, right? It's terrifying. But so the gaps between like the fact that we don't love policies and legislation of behavior has to be made up with ethics and pro-social behavior. All right. Okay, so number 5, are there legal considerations? Consult relevant legislation where necessary. Often, again, you will find it in the dust. In my personal opinion, I'm supposed to say that when I'm being a professor. Okay. Let's see. What are some of the cultural considerations? This story that was just brought up has, race, ethnicity, new American status, religion, there are so many cultural pieces to that to dissect. What was this issue addressed through informed consent? Again, back to our agency policies, back to what we have in place of here's confidentiality. This is what it looks like unless this. To me, I'm like thinking of that case and thinking if this individual is offering $1,000 for sexual behavior, is everyone safe in the community? I don't know. That is a struggle for me to think about, is the client's safety, but who else? And that becomes a huge part of our decision making, right? We have some clients who don't want to share details because it's a family member, it's a church thing, it's a neighbor, but are there risks to others in the community? And I better hurry. What are some of the available options or choices for resolving the dilemma? You have to analyze the risk and benefits of each option. What steps do you need to take to minimize the risk while still meeting your ethical responsibility? Always consult with a peer, a manager, a supervisor. I would never make a decision in a bubble because I know even I have my own perspective. I have my own lens. I have my own biases. And you're protecting yourself through consultation. Does the context of practice make a difference? Discuss the dilemma with the client where appropriate. And I think that is probably appropriate in this situation. An adult who may be new to our country and not understand our relevant legislation and laws and how people are protected. That is huge in child welfare, informing people so that they know. Consider the impact on the therapeutic relationship, assess what other resources might be helpful, document your process. That is key, and monitor and evaluate the impact of the decision and modify if necessary. So I will leave you to these other decision-making cases. Take them to your staff, take them to your group supervision, talk about them, use this model or these models, or maybe you have your own, but thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you, Susan. And we can take a couple of questions here for a couple minutes if anybody has any that they would like to ask.
I love the processing in the chat. That's what I hoped for in breakouts on these scenarios. So. Welcome. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Okay, well, if there's no questions from folks, we will take another break. This one will get started at 3 p.m. So in about 9 minutes. And if you have any questions come up during that time, feel free to continue asking them in the chat or even out loud while we're between sessions.
Susan, can I ask you another question?
Yeah, who is speaking?
This
Jessica?
is Jessica Walters. Yeah.
Sure.
Um, I feel like I know the answer, but then this was another thing that came up with my supervisor, and so then I was like, she kind of acted differently than I would have, so then it made me wonder. So she had a client that that disclosed to her that he committed a murder in the past, and I feel like that should be reported. I feel like that's like where safety is involved, even though it's happened, like he's could also be a risk to someone else, and that's illegal. So I feel like that would be a spot where you would break confidentiality and report that. But she said, I didn't because it had already happened. And he disclosed it like in a group with a whole bunch of people too. Like
Mm.
it was like a group
Well,
discussion.
I should let you know, Jessica, that I always probably, like I said, ethics geek. Like I lean my biases to protect anyone else and also to have support and accountability even for the person who's done that. Like to me, I'm like, why are they bringing that up? They're and processing it. I wanted to say one other thing that I forgot is you may consult with a supervisor and your gut still says, I'm not okay with this. I need to keep processing this. One thing I know from cases is that in most cases, the organization and the clinician are on the same page, but sometimes they're not, right? And you need to check yourself individually and protect your own license. This wasn't a disclosure to you. So this is hearsay upon hearsay. I don't know specifically about your case, but protect your own license, even if you're getting bad advice or what you perceive to be less helpful or effective advice. Does that make sense, Jessica?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Yeah. Because every so often, organizations don't have the back of the clinician and they distance themselves, right? Also, shout out for NASW's insurance policy and having enough. And they also have someone you can call for legal advice. And anyway, I don't mean to scare people, but I usually do. I've probably crossed into scaring people, haven't I, Teresa? Okay.
Yeah, and if you all have more specific questions, you can email Susan or start a conversation with her in direct messages through the chat. But also NASW has their ethics hotline. That's always a great resource. So you've got a lot of options to ask more questions about ethics. For now, though, I will go ahead and stop the questions so we can get our next presenter set up. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.